Have you ever wondered what you would do differently if you got a second chance at life? I never imagined I'd get that opportunity until I opened my eyes and found myself back in my 20-year-old body right before everything went wrong. My name is Rebecca Jensen, but everyone calls me Becca. When I woke up that morning in my old dorm room, I knew exactly what I needed to avoid, or more specifically, who. Mason Reed, the guy who'd destroy my life while trying to save someone else's. The sunlight streaming through my window felt surreal. The last time I'd seen daylight, I was 67 years old, lying in a hospital bed while my own son told me I needed to let his father go. Dad and Claire deserved to be happy, he'd said, like I hadn't spent 45 years of my life making sacrifices for their happiness. But this time would be different. As I stared at my young reflection in the mirror, I made myself a promise. I wouldn't let Mason's misplaced sense of duty ruin both our lives again. No more playing the understanding wife while he spent our marriage taking care of Claire Anderson and her daughter. First things first, I needed to change my spring semester schedule. In my past life, I'd taken advanced chemistry with Mason as my lab partner. That's how it all started. One spilled beaker, one coffee to apologize. And before I knew it, I was trapped in a marriage where I always came second. I grabbed my course catalog and headed straight to the registrar's office. The line was long, but I didn't care. Every minute spent here was a minute not spent falling into Mason's orbit. "Are you sure you want to switch out of advanced chem?" the registrar asked, peering at me over her glasses. "You're one of the top students in that section." "Absolutely," I said firmly. "I'd like to take quantum physics instead." She raised her eyebrows, but started typing. In my past life, I'd never dared to take quantum. Too hard, too demanding, everyone said. But now I knew better. I was capable of so much more than being Mason Reed's supportive wife. "All set," the registrar said, handing me my new schedule, though Professor Thompson is notorious for his tough grading. I smiled, remembering how, in my past life, I'd heard stories about students crying after his exams. But what was a tough professor compared to watching your husband console another woman at your son's wedding? Walking back to my dorm, I checked my phone. 3 missed calls from Mom. Right. In this timeline, I was still engaged to Mason. Our families had arranged it when we were kids, back when his dad saved my family's farm during the drought of '98. Mom's voicemail was exactly what I expected. "Honey, Mason's mother called. They're planning the engagement party for next month. Call me back." I sat on a bench watching students rush to their morning classes. The engagement party. That's where it all started falling apart last time. Claire showed up, 7 months pregnant and recently widowed. Her husband, Mason's best friend from high school, had died in a car crash. Mason promised to look after her, and that promise turned into 45 years of putting her first. "Becca!" A familiar voice made my stomach drop. I looked up to see Mason jogging toward me, his dark hair messy from the wind. He looked so young, so innocent, like he hadn't spent decades breaking my heart yet. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "I was just heading to class. I tried to find you in chem," he said, falling into step beside me. "Thompson at the registrar's said you switched out." Of course he'd checked. Mason Reed, always trying to fix things, always trying to help. That was his problem. He helped everyone except his own wife. "Yeah, decided to challenge myself with quantum instead," I replied, picking up my pace. He grabbed my arm gently, making me stop. "Is everything okay? You've been different lately, ever since..." "Ever since what?" I asked, even though I knew exactly what he meant. In this timeline, we'd had our first big fight last week. He'd invited Claire to dinner without telling me, and I'd walked in to find them laughing in our kitchen. "Look, I know you're not comfortable with Claire being around," he started. I cut him off. "You're right, I'm not. And I'm not going to pretend to be okay with it anymore." His face fell. The old Becca would have backtracked, would have apologized, would have tried to be understanding. But I wasn't that Becca anymore. She's going through a rough time, he began, using that patient tone I'd grown to hate. Her husband... I know about Tom, I interrupted, and I'm sorry for her loss, but that doesn't mean you have to be her savior. I promised Tom I'd look after them if anything happened to him, Mason said, running a hand through his hair in frustration. What kind of person would I be if I broke that promise? And what about your promises to me? I asked quietly. Do they matter less because I'm still here? He looked stunned. In our past life, I'd never confronted him like this. I'd stayed quiet, played the understanding fiancé, then wife. Not this time. I need to get to class, I said, pulling away from him. Oh, and about the engagement party. Don't worry about it. I already called it off. You what? His voice cracked. Becca, wait! But I was already walking away, my heart pounding. In my bag was my acceptance letter to Stanford's graduate program in physics, something I'd never even dreamed of applying to in my past life. Back in my dorm, I pulled out the calendar where I'd been marking off days until my escape. 2 weeks left. Just 2 weeks until I could start my new life. A life where I wouldn't spend decades watching Mason and Claire's beautiful friendship destroy everything I loved. My phone buzzed again. Mom. I took a deep breath and answered. Rebecca Jensen, what is this I hear about you breaking off the engagement? Mason's mother is beside herself. Mom, I said calmly, I'm not marrying Mason, but his family helped us keep the farm. How could you be so ungrateful? I closed my eyes, remembering all the times she'd used this argument in my past life. The farm debt was paid off years ago. We don't owe them anything anymore. But, no buts, Mom. I'm going to Stanford. The silence on the other end was deafening. In my past life, I'd never told anyone about getting accepted. I quietly declined the offer and married Mason instead. Stanford? Mom finally whispered. But what about Mason? Mason will be fine, I said, thinking of how quickly he'd moved Claire into our old apartment after I'd died. He has Claire. Claire? Tom's widow? What does she have to do with anything? I almost laughed. What did Claire have to do with anything? Only everything. But I couldn't explain that to Mom. Couldn't tell her how I'd watched Mason spend every holiday, every milestone, every important moment with Claire and her daughter while I sat alone. Trust me, Mom. This is for the best. After hanging up, I went back to packing. Most of my books were already sold. I'd need the money for grad school. As I folded my clothes, there was a knock at the door. I opened the door to find Claire standing there, her baby bump visible under her flowery dress. Just like last time. But this time, I wasn't the naive girl who'd invite her in for tea. Can I help you? I asked, keeping my hand on the doorknob. I heard about you and Mason, she said softly. Her green eyes were filled with tears, the same trick that had worked on me for 45 years. He's devastated, Becca. And you came to tell me this because... She placed her hand on her stomach, another calculated move. Mason's been so supportive since Tom died. He's the only one who still checks on me, who makes sure I'm eating properly. That's nice, I cut her off, but it has nothing to do with me anymore. How can you be so cold? Her voice cracked. I lost my husband. I'm having a baby alone. And I'm sorry for that, I said firmly. But using Mason's guilt to manipulate him? That's on you. Her eyes widened. In my past life, I'd never seen through her act. I'd believed she was just a grieving widow who needed help. It took decades to realize she'd planned everything, from showing up at our engagement party to moving next door after we married. I don't know what you're talking about, she stammered. Sure you don't. I smiled without warmth. Just like you didn't know what you were doing when you called Mason every time your sink leaked, or when you needed someone to assemble your baby's crib, or when you couldn't sleep because you were too scared to be alone. Her face changed then, the helpless widow act dropping for just a second. I saw what Mason never had, the calculation behind those tears. He promised Tom. He promised to look after you, not to give up his entire life for you. I leaned closer. But that's what you wanted, isn't it? To make sure he was always there, always available, always putting you first. You're being ridiculous, she said, but her hand trembled as she wiped her tears. Mason and I are just friends. I laughed, actually laughed. Friends? Is that what you call it when you manipulate someone into spending every holiday with you instead of his wife? When you make sure your daughter calls him dad, but never let her near his actual wife? How could you know? Her mask slipped completely now. It doesn't matter how I know. What matters is that I'm done. Mason's all yours. You can guilt him into marrying you after I leave, just like last time. Last time? She looked confused, then shook her head. You're not making any sense. Mason would never... Give it a few months, I said, starting to close the door. Once the scandal of our broken engagement dies down, you'll find a way to make it happen. You always do. I shut the door in her face, my hands shaking. In my past life, this visit had ended differently. I'd invited her in, made her tea, listened to her cry about how much she needed Mason's support. I'd felt guilty for even thinking about being jealous. My phone buzzed with a text from Mason. We need to talk. Please. I ignored it and went back to packing. My Stanford acceptance letter sat on top of my clothes, my ticket to freedom. In 2 weeks, I'd be gone. No more Mason, no more Claire, no more watching my life slip away while trying to be the understanding wife. There was another knock at the door, harder this time. Becca, I know you're in there. Mason's voice came through. Please, just let me explain. I stayed silent, remembering how many times I'd heard those words in our marriage. Let me explain why I can't make it to your father's funeral. Claire needs help with Emma's school project. Let me explain why we can't go on vacation. Claire's having a rough time around Tom's death anniversary. Let me explain why I missed our son's basketball game. Emma had a dance recital. The knocking continued, growing more insistent. Becca, please. You're not being fair. Not being fair. Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. In my past life, he'd said the exact same thing when I found out Claire was moving into the apartment next door. You're not being fair, Becca. She needs to be close to someone she trusts. I grabbed my phone and texted my roommate. If you're coming back, wait an hour. Mason's outside. Sophie replied immediately. Want me to call campus security? No, I typed back. He'll leave eventually. I sat on my bed listening to Mason's pleas through the door. He was right. I wasn't being fair, but 45 years of being fair had cost me everything. My marriage, my son's love, my dignity. At least tell me what I did wrong, he called out. We can fix this. Fix this. That was Mason's answer to everything. But some things couldn't be fixed. Like watching your son dance with Claire at his wedding while you sat alone at a corner table. Like hearing your grandson call Claire Grandma while referring to you as Mrs. Reed. My phone buzzed again, Mason's mother this time. I declined the call, remembering how she'd always sided with Claire. She needs our support, Becca. Don't be selfish. Selfish. That word had followed me throughout my marriage. I was selfish for wanting Mason home for Christmas instead of at Claire's. Selfish for asking him to attend our son's parent-teacher conferences instead of Emma's dance competitions. Selfish for expecting my husband to put me first. Finally, after what felt like hours, Mason's footsteps retreated down the hallway. I waited a few more minutes before opening my door carefully. A small box sat on the doormat. The silver bracelet his mother had given me when we got engaged. I picked it up, remembering how proud I'd been to wear it. How sure I'd been that Mason and I would have a perfect life together. Back then, I thought love was enough. I didn't understand that love without respect, without boundaries, without equal commitment, was just another form of prison. Inside the box was a note. This was my grandmother's. Mom gave it to you because she thought you'd be the perfect wife for me. I still think she was right. Please don't throw away what we have. I closed the box and slid it into my backpack. Tomorrow I'd sell it along with my other jewelry. Every penny would help with graduate school expenses. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. You're right about everything, but he'll never believe you. C. Claire. Of course she'd found a way to get my number. In my past life, she'd always been good at getting what she wanted while making it look like coincidence. I blocked the number without responding. In my previous life, I'd spent decades trying to prove what Claire was doing. The subtle manipulation, the calculated helplessness, the way she'd trained her daughter to depend on Mason. But he never saw it. He only saw a grieving widow who needed his help. The next morning I woke up early to avoid running into Mason at the campus coffee shop. But as I rounded the corner, I saw him sitting at our usual table, 2 cups in front of him, waiting, just like he used to do every morning in our past life, until Claire started having anxiety attacks that required his immediate attention. I turned around, but he'd already spotted me. Becca, please, just 5 minutes. Instead of stopping, I walked faster. Behind me, I heard the scrape of his chair, his quick footsteps. You can't avoid me forever, he called out. Watch me, I muttered, ducking into the library. But Mason followed me in, ignoring the librarian's warning look. What about our families? He whispered, catching up to me between the bookshelves. What about everything we planned? I spun around. You mean everything our parents planned? We were kids, Mason. They arranged this marriage because your family helped mine. That's not a good enough reason anymore. It's more than that, he insisted. We're good together, everyone says so. Everyone? I laughed quietly. You mean like Claire? His face darkened. Why do you keep bringing her up? She's just a friend who needs help. She's a grown woman who's perfectly capable of helping herself, I said, pulling my Stanford letter from my bag. And while you're busy being her knight in shining armor, I'm going to do this. He took the letter, his face paling as he read. Stanford? But that's across the country. Exactly. You can't just leave, he said, his voice cracking. What about us? What about our future? Our future? I stepped closer, lowering my voice. Let me tell you about our future, Mason. You'll marry me because it's what everyone expects. Then Claire will need a place to stay and you'll offer to help her find an apartment. Somehow the only suitable one will be right next door to us. That's ridiculous. Then her daughter will be born and you'll spend more time with them than with me. Every holiday, every special moment, you'll be there for them instead of your own family. And I'll watch it all happen, telling myself, I'm being understanding, I'm being kind, I'm being a good wife. His face went through a range of emotions, shock, denial, anger. You're making Claire sound like some kind of manipulator. She's a widow, Becca. Her husband was my best friend. And that's exactly why you'll never see it, I said softly. You'll spend the next 40 years trying to replace Tom, and she'll spend them making sure you do. 40 years? He shook his head. You're not making any sense. Of course I wasn't. How could I explain that I'd already lived this life, that I'd watched it all play out exactly as I'd described? Just let me go, Mason, I said, taking the Stanford letter back. Let me have a chance at a different life, by running away to California. He ran his hands through his hair, a nervous habit I remembered all too well. This isn't you, Becca. You never even mentioned wanting to go to graduate school before, because in my past life, I never dared to dream that big. I'd been so focused on being the perfect wife, the understanding partner, that I'd forgotten about my own dreams. Maybe you don't know me as well as you think, I replied, turning away. What about my job offer at the research lab? He called after me. We talked about building a life here together. I stopped. In my past life, that job had been his excuse for everything. He couldn't leave because of his position. He couldn't transfer because the lab needed him. Meanwhile, Claire conveniently got a teaching job at the local school, keeping them close together for decades. "Take it," I said without turning around. "I'm sure Claire will be happy to have you nearby." I walked out of the library, ignoring his protests. My hands were shaking as I made my way to quantum physics, the class I'd been too scared to take in my past life, too worried about disappointing everyone with anything less than perfect grades. Professor Thompson was already writing equations on the board when I walked in. The seat next to me was empty, everyone too intimidated to sit in the front row. Good. I needed space to think. My phone vibrated. A message from Mason's sister. "Mom's crying. How could you do this to our families?" I turned off my phone. In my previous life, guilt had been their weapon of choice. Every time I complained about Mason's relationship with Claire, his family would remind me of how their help had saved my parents' farm. How could I be so ungrateful? How could I deny Mason the chance to honor his best friend's memory? But not this time. This time I wouldn't let guilt trap me in a lifetime of watching another woman steal my husband piece by piece. After class, I headed straight to the pawn shop. The owner examined Mason's grandmother's bracelet carefully. "Beautiful piece," he said. "Family heirloom?" "Not anymore," I replied, thinking of how, in my past life, this bracelet had eventually ended up on Emma's wrist. A gift from her Uncle Mason on her 16th birthday, while our own son got nothing. The pawn shop owner offered me $300 for the bracelet. In my past life, I would have been horrified at the thought of selling a family heirloom. But now, all I felt was relief. That money would help cover my first month's rent in California. Walking back to my dorm, I spotted Claire sitting on a bench near the science building. She was dabbing her eyes with a tissue while a group of students watched sympathetically. Of course, she'd picked the spot where Mason would see her after his afternoon lab. I walked past without acknowledging her, but her voice carried clearly. "I don't know what I'll do without him around. Tom always said Mason was the only one he trusted." In my past life, I'd fallen for this act. I'd felt so guilty about taking Mason away from his responsibilities that I'd encouraged him to spend time with Claire. That was my biggest mistake. Back in my dorm, I found a stack of letters under my door. One from Mason's mother, two from my parents, and a small note that made my blood run cold. "I know you think you can just leave, but Mason made a promise to Tom. He can't break that. Not even for you. C." I crumpled Claire's note and threw it away. In my previous life, she'd sent similar messages throughout our marriage. Subtle reminders that her claim on Mason predated mine, that her need was greater than mine. My phone rang. Mason again. This time I answered. "What do you want?" "I just saw Claire," he said, his voice tight. "She's really struggling, Becca. The stress of all this isn't good for the baby." I almost laughed. Some things never changed. Claire was still using her pregnancy to manipulate him. "That's not my problem anymore," I said firmly. "How can you be so cold? She just lost her husband, and I'm sorry for her loss," I interrupted. "But I'm not going to spend my life watching you try to replace Tom." "Replace? What are you talking about? I'm just helping a friend." "No, Mason. You're trying to fulfill a promise that was never yours to make. Tom asked you to look after them, not to give up your entire life for them." There was a long silence on the other end. Finally, Mason spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "I sold the bracelet. Now it was my turn to be silent." "What?" I gripped my phone tighter. "Claire saw you going into the pawn shop," he said, his voice hardening. "She told me you were probably selling the bracelet. I went and bought it back. How could you, Becca? That was my grandmother's." In my past life, this would have been the moment I broke down, apologized, promised to be better. But not this time. "You want to know how I could?" My voice was steady. "Because I'm done being the understanding one. Done watching you build a life with someone else while I stand in the background. That bracelet? In my future. You gave it to Emma on her 16th birthday. Not to our son, not to our daughter. To Claire's child." "You're not making any sense," Mason said. "Emma's not even born yet." How could you possibly? It doesn't matter how I know. I cut him off. What matters is that I'm choosing myself this time. Keep the bracelet, Mason. Give it to whoever you want. I won't be around to see it. I hung up before he could respond. My hands were shaking, but not from guilt or fear. For the first time in either of my lives, I felt free. A knock at my door made me freeze. Not again. But when I opened it, it was just my roommate Sophie. "Hey," she said, eyeing me cautiously. "You okay?" I saw Mason camping outside earlier. "I'm fine," I replied, managing a smile. "Actually, I'm better than fine." Sophie sat on her bed watching me pack. "You're really leaving, huh?" "2 more days," I nodded. "My train leaves Thursday morning." "What about Mason? And that pregnant lady who keeps hanging around?" I paused, folding a sweater. "They'll figure it out. They always do." My phone buzzed with another text from Claire. "He bought back the bracelet, see? He'll always choose what's right, what's proper. You're just making this harder on everyone." I blocked her number again, remembering how in my past life, these gentle reminders had kept coming. Every time I tried to stand up for myself, Claire would find a way to make me feel guilty, to remind me that I was the selfish one for wanting my husband's attention. "Want me to go with you to the station on Thursday?" Sophie asked, breaking into my thoughts. "No," I said, smiling at her concern. "It's better if I go alone." I didn't tell her that in my past life, Mason and Claire had shown up at the station. They'd convinced me to stay, using the same arguments about family obligations and doing what's right. Not this time. The next 2 days passed in a blur of final preparations. I sold most of my textbooks, keeping only the ones I'd need for graduate school, packed the few clothes I couldn't bear to part with, cleared out my small savings account. On my last night in the dorm, I heard familiar voices outside my window. Mason and Claire, their shadows visible on the sidewalk below. "She's really leaving." Claire's voice drifted up. "What about your parents? What about the farm debt?" "The debt was paid off years ago," Mason replied, sounding tired. "But your mother, she'll be heartbroken." "And what about Tom's wish? He wanted you to be part of Emma's life." I closed the window, shutting out their voices. In my past life, I'd overheard this same conversation. It had been the final push I needed to give up my dreams and stay. To be the good, understanding wife everyone expected me to be. Morning came too quickly. I grabbed my bags and headed to the station before dawn, knowing Mason would try one last time to stop me. The platform was almost empty, just a few early commuters clutching coffee cups. As I waited for my train, I pulled out my phone and typed one final message to Mason. "In another life, I stayed. I watched you build a family with Claire while I faded into the background. I watched our son grow up calling her mom, while I became Mrs. Reed. I watched you miss every important moment in our lives because Claire or Emma needed you more. I died alone, regretting every minute I spent being the understanding wife. But not this time. This time, I choose me." I hit send and turned off my phone just as my train pulled into the station. As I settled into my seat, I caught a glimpse of Mason running onto the platform, Claire right behind him. But the train was already moving. Through the window, I watched Mason's figure grow smaller until he disappeared completely. Just like in my past life, Claire was by his side, one hand on her stomach, the other on his arm. But this time, the sight didn't break my heart. My Stanford acceptance letter sat in my lap, my passport to a new life. As the train picked up speed, memories from my past life flashed through my mind. Mason missing our son's birth because Emma had a fever. Coming home late every Christmas Eve because Claire needed help wrapping presents. Sitting alone at parent-teacher conferences while he attended Emma's dance recitals. Our son's wedding, where he spent more time comforting Claire than celebrating with me. But those memories were just ghosts now, stories from a life I wouldn't let repeat. 6 months later, I was deep into my graduate studies when the news reached me. Mason had married Claire in a small ceremony. Just like in my past life, they'd waited until the scandal of our broken engagement died down. My mother called, crying about how I'd thrown away my chance at happiness. But she didn't understand. Happiness wasn't being the understanding wife who watched her husband love another family. Happiness was this: my tiny apartment near campus, filled with physics books and possibilities. 10 years passed. I earned my PhD, became a professor, did research that actually made a difference. Sometimes I'd hear snippets about Mason and Claire through mutual friends, how they lived in the same town where we would have settled, how Emma called him Dad while Claire made sure everyone knew what a saint he was for keeping his promise to Tom. But those stories didn't hurt anymore. They were just reminders of the life I'd escaped. 20 years after that morning at the train station, I was presenting my research at a national conference when I spotted a familiar face in the crowd. My son from my past life, except he wasn't my son in this timeline. He was Mason and Claire's youngest, born a year after their marriage. He looked just like I remembered. Same brown eyes, same serious expression. But this time he wasn't looking at me with disappointment, wasn't begging me to divorce his father so Mason and Claire could finally be together. This time I was just another scientist he'd come to hear speak. After my presentation, he approached me with a question about quantum mechanics. As we talked, I saw no trace of the anger and resentment that had filled our relationship in my past life. Here, we were just two physicists discussing theory. It was better this way. That night in my hotel room, I thought about how different both our lives were in this timeline. In my past life, he'd grown up watching his father prioritize another family, learning from Mason that it was okay to treat me as an afterthought. But in this life, he'd grown up with both his parents present, while I'd built a life focused on my own dreams, rather than someone else's obligations. As I packed up to leave the conference, my phone buzzed with a news alert from my hometown. Mason's mother had passed away. In my past life, I'd been there when she died, still trying to be the perfect daughter-in-law, even as she praised Claire's devotion to her son. But this time, I was free from the obligation to attend the funeral, free from watching Claire play the grieving daughter while I stood in the background, free from pretending that 45 years of being second choice hadn't broken me. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. A draft email from the Nobel Committee waited in my inbox. They wanted me to serve as a reviewer for next year's physics nominations. In my past life, I'd never even finished college. Now I was helping select Nobel Prize winners. Sometimes I wondered if Mason ever thought about how different our lives could have been, if he ever realized what Claire's helplessness had cost both of us. But those thoughts didn't consume me anymore. They were just occasional whispers from a past I'd chosen to rewrite. My assistant knocked on my door. "Dr. Jensen, your next class is starting in 5 minutes." I gathered my materials, smiling at the nameplate on my door. Doctor. Rebecca Jensen, Department Chair, Quantum Physics. No Mrs. Reed here. No living in someone else's shadow. As I walked to my lecture hall, I passed a young couple arguing near the physics building. The girl was crying about giving up a scholarship to stay close to her boyfriend. For a moment, I saw myself in her, the old me, the one who'd sacrificed everything for someone else's happiness. I stopped and turned around. "Choose yourself," I told her quietly. "Whatever else happens, choose yourself first." She looked startled, but something in my eyes must have reached her. She nodded slowly, wiping her tears. Walking away, I felt lighter. In my past life, no one had told me it was okay to put myself first. No one had warned me that love without boundaries wasn't love at all. It was just another form of cage. But now I knew better, and maybe, just maybe, I could help others avoid the trap I'd escaped. In the end, the most important promise we can keep isn't to others. It's to ourselves. Like and subscribe to hear more stories of second chances and self-discovery. Later that night, back in my office, I found an old photo while cleaning out my desk. It had somehow survived all these years. A picture from the day Mason and I got engaged in my past life. We looked so young, so hopeful. I was wearing that silver bracelet, smiling like I had the whole world ahead of me. In a way, I did. Just not the world I'd imagined. My phone buzzed. An email from the conference organizers. They wanted me to be the keynote speaker next year. The topic? Breaking boundaries in quantum physics, how one discovery can change everything. I smiled at the irony. One discovery had changed everything for me. The discovery that I could choose a different path. Just then, my computer pinged with a social media notification. Someone had tagged me in an old university photo. There we all were. Mason, Claire, me, and our old classmates. But this time seeing their faces didn't bring pain. They were just people from my past, characters in a story I'd chosen not to finish. I closed my laptop and walked to the window. The campus was quiet, stars twinkling above the research buildings. Somewhere out there, in another timeline, another Rebecca was still trapped in that cycle of sacrifice and regret. But this Rebecca was free. And that made all the difference. Want more stories about choosing yourself? Hit subscribe and join me next week for another journey of self-discovery.